Integrity is the thing. It's the choices the legends are made of. Integrity is making the right choice regardless. It's obeying God and leaving the consequences up to him. That is a legacy. I'm really excited for part 2 of this series, The Choices Legends Are Made Of. This series, like Annie said, is all about the life of Daniel. And today's message is all about this one word, integrity. And this word is a simple word, but man, it is a powerful word, especially when it shows up in our lives. And whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, I think we can all agree that integrity is really important. And here's how I know, and you know, that integrity is important, is you hope, if you're a spouse, you hope that your significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, you hope that they are a person who has integrity. If you're in college or you have a roommate, you hope that your roommate is a person who has high integrity. If you have a job, you hope that your coworkers are people of integrity, or your boss is somebody who's a person of high integrity. We hope that people that are leading in our government, that they are people of high integrity. We value integrity. We think that it's important. If you're a mom or a dad and your daughter in particular is dating a young man, you hope that that young fellow is a person of integrity, right? And the same goes for men, for sons that are dating girls, we hope that they are people of integrity, because integrity matters. Integrity is this thing inside of us that guides us. It acts as like a compass for our lives. It's the deciding factor for us when it comes to the pressure of the moment. Our integrity, or lack thereof, is the thing that ends up having the impact on the choices that we make. And as I was preparing this series and thinking about this specific message today, I was reminded of a verse that, I grew up, some of you guys know this, I grew up going to church as a young kid and grew up going to Christian school. And in Christian school, we had to memorize verses, which I was so bad at. I have the memory of a goldfish. There's no retention of things like that. I was never good at reciting Bible verses. So my Bible verse recollection is always like somewhere in Proverbs, they talk about integrity, So Google's so helpful. I Googled, verses in Proverbs about integrity. And I was reminded that Proverbs is the book of wisdom. So it was all about integrity. But I found the verse, and it's in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 3, and it says this: the integrity of the upright will guide them, right? Integrity, just like we got done talking about, it's like this guiding force inside of all of us. And in most of the verses in Proverbs, there's like this counterpoint, right? But when it comes to people that don't have integrity, that aren't leading with integrity, it says this: but the crookedness of the treacherous will destroy them. And we know that this is true because some of you, maybe most of you, have been on the receiving end, or at least have heard a story of someone who hasn't led with or acted with integrity, and that choice or that ultimate decision that they made that wasn't a choice of integrity, that it had a negative impact on them and maybe even on those around them. So integrity is extremely important. And this idea that we're looking at today is in Proverbs at the beginning of our service is interesting, because this word upright, the word that's used in the Hebrew text, which is what the Old Testament is, it's the Hebrew text, that word means to actually stand upright, to be standing at attention. And it's interesting that another word, crookedness, is this idea of being bent over. It's a physical representation of staying upright, that when we can stay upright, that when we act with integrity, that somehow it's anchored to our ability to see the end game, to see the ultimate goal, to see far off into the distance, that our choices have consequences, which we can all agree with. But that somehow when we're operating in crookedness, that when we're kind of bent over and we're just focusing on what is directly in front of us, isn't it true that when we're focused on directly what's in front of us and not so much the consequences of the future, that we tend to not make the best choices? And today, as we as we step into the next part of this series on Daniel, we're going to look at a guy who has decided again and again to stand upright and to keep his eyes on the ultimate goal, which is to be a man of integrity. And for him, as someone who believed in God, he believed that ultimately that he needed to keep his eyes on God, which ended up making him a legend. And the choice to operate with integrity ended up being one of the choices that legends are made of. Last week, we kicked off this series by talking about Daniel chapter 1, the very beginning of Daniel's life. There's a king named King Nebuchadnezzar that came in and wiped out basically all of the people that lived were in and around where Daniel lived. And King Nebuchadnezzar captured Daniel and some of his friends with the sole purpose of indoctrinating them in the hopes that he could make them believe what he believed, that he could kind of bring them into the belief system of the Babylonians and then put them into roles of lower level leadership inside of his kingdom in the hopes that he could manipulate the areas around them to follow him more closely. And if you remember from last week, and if you missed last week, like Annie mentioned earlier, you can go to our website and get caught up on that. I would encourage you to do that. But Daniel, because he was a man of integrity, he resolved ahead of time. He knew ahead of time that no matter what the king did or whatever it was, that he was going to choose to do the right thing, that he was ultimately going to do what God said and not what the king said. The reason why Daniel became a legend was because Daniel made up his mind ahead of time. He resolved. We talked a lot about this word resolve last week. We talked about this idea that ultimately for me and for you and for Daniel, that the standards that we resolve to live by determine the life we live. And this is true for you, that the standards that you resolve to live by, that they determine the life that you live, that your integrity, my integrity, is ultimately directly connected to the outcomes of our life. Today, as we look at the next part of this story in Daniel's life, we're going to skip way ahead. So if you're one of those perfectionists that really love things to go in chronological order, I'm really sorry. We are skipping, in 1 week, we're going 55 years into the future. So Daniel has now aged 55 years, which may be what's going to happen to you in the first week of school. I'm really sorry about that, but that's where we're going. So Daniel, today we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 6. So if you brought your Bible with you, you can go ahead and head there. If you've got it on your phone, if you didn't bring any of those, no problem at all. Or if you just like to follow along, I'm going to have it all here on the screen for us. So just to kind of set the stage, 55 years has passed. Daniel is now no longer a young man in captivity. He is now an old man who's in a role of leadership inside of the kingdom of a brand new king. His name is King Darius. And this is not to be confused with Darius the Great. This is a different king. This is the lesser great Darius. His name was King Darius the Mede. But King Darius really saw that Daniel, even though multiple different kings had ruled, that somehow Daniel just stayed this person of high integrity and wise counsel. And so as King Darius was setting up his government, he had all of these governors and all of these advisors that ruled over all these different areas. And he assigned special governors, 3 of them, to rule over hundreds of other governors. And they were really proud of that, right? As you can understand, it's kind of what happens in our world today. You give someone just a little bit of authority, So these guys got really high on the horse, and King Darius really frustrated these guys because he's like, you guys are great, but Daniel's actually greater. And so I'm going to make Daniel my second in command. I'm going to make him like the vice president, basically, and he's going to be over all of you and all of the governors, which made them really, really mad. And that is kind of the beginning point and the crux of the story that we're going to look at today. So we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, and this is what we find. Now Daniel had so distinguished himself among the administrators and the governors. If you're following along in your Bible, some of them say satraps, which was just kind of their word for governors, had so distinguished himself among the administrators and governors by his exceptional qualities that the king placed him and set him over the whole kingdom. Again, kind of like in our world today, made him the vice president. Verse 4. At this, the administrators and the governors, the men underneath him, tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. They were hoping to find some type of behavior or some type of poor decision that he had made in the past, something that they could bring to King Darius and go, hey man, this guy that you put in charge of us, he shouldn't be in charge, you should remove him. Like, we got this. We don't need Daniel, He's not even he's not even like Persian, He's Judean. He shouldn't be in any role of government, right? But here's what's so crazy about Daniel, and this is so inspiring. I hope it's inspiring for you too. Here's what was true. They were unable to do so. That in 55 years of leadership and inside of government, nonetheless, that they could not find a single thing in Daniel or that Daniel had done. They couldn't even find somebody who was willing to lie about Daniel. Verse 4 goes on. It says that they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And they're like, well, dang it, this kind of ruins our plan. What are we going to do? And so they conspired against Daniel. They got a small group of guys together and they came up with a plan. And we find in verse 5 that this is what they came up with. Finally, these men said that we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless, and man, as followers of Jesus, isn't this such an inspiring thing that and I hope someone would say this about me. We can't find anything about Daniel that's going to trip him up. There's nothing that's going to get him in trouble. We can't find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Could you imagine if this was true for all followers of Jesus? That when they looked at our lives, that the only thing where we've misstepped or we've treated somebody poorly or we, have made a poor decision, that there was none of that. And the only thing that could be said negatively about us is that they would just say, you know what? They are radically committed to following that guy they call Jesus. Imagine what that would mean for our world, for our country, and for your home and for your kids. It would change everything. And for Daniel, it was true of him, and it made him a legend. Not that Daniel was perfect, but Daniel had set himself so far apart from the rest of the crowd that the only way that these men could trip him up was by making the king put something in place that would go against God's law. The King Darius knew Daniel was not going to turn away from. So in verse 7, this is kind of how it all plays out. They all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being other than King Darius during the next 30 days would be thrown in the lion's den. So they show up and they're like, hey, King Darius, we have this idea. You're a new king and you're just the best, right? They're like totally playing into King Darius's pride and ego. They're inflating him in this moment. They're like, we would like to have 30 days of King Darius. It's going to be a great celebration. We'll have commemorative bobbleheads, we'll get hats and t-shirts and balloons. There'll be cake. It's going to be great, Darius, but during this time, to make sure that people only focus on you, what if we just made a rule? It's not going to be that big of a deal. It's just 30 days that only during that time that only people will pray to you, not even our own gods. And King Darius is like, okay, that kind of sounds good, right? So in verse 8, we continue on, and it's in verse 8, verse 8, your majesty, issue the decree, put it in writing. Now, this was such a big deal in the ancient Near Eastern times because kings would just speak stuff into existence. They're like, today, everybody that's wearing blue is getting, get rid of them, And then halfway through that process, I changed my mind. It was always this willy-nilly leadership style. And they're like, what if we actually made rulers write things down and then held them accountable for what they said? So they'd put this in place, and even in the ancient Near East, that writing something down had this magical element to it. And so they knew, hey, don't just say it, King Darius, write it down. And he does, writing it down so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which again, cannot be repealed. And King Darius, because again, he was so easily manipulated by his pride and his ego, he's like, this sounds awesome. Throw me the party. And in verse 9, King Darius puts the decree into writing. And immediately the word goes out that King Darius had written down this new edict, this new decree amongst the land. And David is forced with a decision. And in verse 10, we see that Daniel learned that the decree had been published. And he went home to his upstairs room where the windows were open. And he did something. And my question for you, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, in this moment where the pressure is on, And it's going to cost you something. Because it was definitely going to cost Daniel something. He knew that most likely whatever decision he made was the difference between death and life. What would you do? When you think about how your integrity, and when it comes to these types of moments, when the pressure's on and it's time for you to make a decision that might cost you something, what would you do? The truth is, I actually know the answer for me, and I actually know the answer for you as well. I know the answer to an even better question, which is, what do you do? What would you do? What do you do when you're certain that doing the right thing will cost you? And the answer is it depends on what? Or who? It depends on what or who you allow to guide you. The answer to this question for most of us is contingent on what actually guides us. That when it comes to when the pressure is on and you have to make the right decision, it's probably going to cost you something. Isn't it true, if we're really being really honest, that it depends on what or who actually guides you? And it's in these moments where the pressure is on and it's going to cost us something that we discover that integrity, ultimately, that integrity for me and for you, that it's a means to an end, or that it may be a means to an end, that this is when we discover if integrity is a means to an end and that it comes to an end when it no longer serves our end. I know this is super wordy, but I want you to get it. This is when we discover if integrity is just a means to an end that comes to an end when it no longer serves our end. And if you're a follower of Jesus, it's deeper than this. Because isn't it true that it's in these moments that we discover if our faith is just a means to an end that comes to an end when it no longer serves our end? That when our desired outcome and our hope for the future and our wants and needs and our desires and the plans that we have, that when the pressure is on and our integrity is challenged, or really your faithfulness to God is challenged, this is that moment when that's tested, that we really understand who or what is the ultimate authority and the ultimate win and the ultimate end of our life. When our integrity is tested in these moments, we learn so much about ourselves. Isn't that true? And what's even more true, really, is that in these moments, they're not really a test, because you and I can plan and study and prepare for tests. Really, it's a pop quiz. These are moments in your life, and you can remember these pop quiz moments where you were just living your life, going about your day, and then in an instant, there's a moment where you are forced to choose one way or the other. To walk the path of integrity, to walk the path of faithfulness to God, to Jesus, if you're a follower of Him, or to go a different way. And when it costs you something, and when we make that decision, this is the moment where you and I, when we discover who we are, where you will learn who you are, and maybe even more importantly, whose you are. Because it's in these moments when our integrity and our desired outcomes are challenged that we learn what we're really made of. And if the things that we have resolved to do were really resolved, that our mind was really made up, and that our integrity leads the way. Here's what we see next with Daniel and his story in verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. So he didn't even go into hiding. It wasn't like he was on the first floor with all the doors closed. He's like, God, we're good, right? If I just pray down here, we'll be good. He went upstairs to where everybody could see him. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. His integrity, his resolve, his faithfulness was unshaken. And here's what Daniel modeled that you and I ultimately know, that our decision is ultimately linked to who you think is responsible for outcomes. Don't miss this. For Daniel, Daniel knew, because he had lived a long life, that many kings before King Darius thought that they were responsible for outcomes, that they were the ultimate authority, that they were the ultimate power. But Daniel knew, because he had known King Nebuchadnezzar, who, by the way, wasn't alive anymore, that there was someone higher and someone greater. There was a higher authority, a higher king. And so Daniel responds in this moment, and he goes and he prays, and because those guys were, conspiring against him, they probably had spies outside that reported back to them, and they said, well, your boy did just as we thought he would. He prayed. So in verse 12, they go to the king, and they spoke to him about his royal decree, which this is so sly and slick, by the way. They show up to the king, and they said, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, the big party, the 30 days of Darius, that anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, oh, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? King Darius is like, yeah, man, I wrote it down even. And they're like, that's right, you did. The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which he even points out that because you wrote it down, it can't be repealed. I said, well, that's what we thought, Darius. We're so disappointed. Just so disappointed. Aren't we, guys? Aren't we so disappointed? Yeah, we're so disappointed. We got to tell you, Daniel, the guy that you put in charge over us, Daniel, the wise sage who's spoken into all these amazing moments, Daniel, who we could find no other fault with, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah. I love how they put that in there. That guy that's not really us. He's not he doesn't look like us. He doesn't talk like us. He pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to your decree that you put into writing. He prays 3 times a day. And in this moment, King Darius is confronted with this unfortunate reality that his pride and his ego had been taken advantage of. Because you see, King Darius ultimately saw Daniel as his friend, his closest confidant. It's why he picked him to be vice president. It's why he put him as the second man in charge. And I have to believe, in fact, the following verses let us know this, that King Darius was devastated by this reality. And in this moment, and this is another message in another series for another time, Darius learned something that you and I need to know and own. It's kind of a funny quote from a friend of ours who's a pastor in our network. He says this, he says, your ego is not your amigo. You see, King Darius's pride and ego was leveraged against him. And isn't it true that for many of us have experienced being on the other side of somebody who wasn't willing to let their pride and their ego step to the side so that integrity could lead the way? And it's a funny thing to say, but for Darius, he learned pretty quickly, my ego was not my amigo. So the king was stuck. He was forced into following through on the decree. And in verse 16, the king gave the order and brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And he was devastated. And as they lowered Daniel down or threw him down into the pit, however that all played out, Darius knew that most likely it was a death sentence for his friend. You see, the Persians believed that when you threw somebody down into the lion's den, that overnight, that if the lions ate the person down there, that they were guilty, and that if the lions didn't eat that person, that they were considered innocent, that the Persian gods, in some way, shape, or form, that they intervened in those moments. And funny enough, no one had ever been innocent. Hungry lions, they eat every time. And so Darius is just his heart broken, and he calls down into the lion's den where his friend Daniel is sitting. And this is so amazing because Darius didn't believe in Daniel's God. But he says this, the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, who I have watched you submit and surrender the totality of your life to over and over and over again, may he rescue you. And a stone was brought and put over the mouth of the lion's den. And the king in anguish goes back to the castle. Says, verse 18 says, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment. So none of the fun king stuff being brought to him, and he could not sleep. because King Darius had been there time and time again. He had seen what happens when people get thrown in the lion's den. And so he didn't sleep all night, and when the sun comes up in verse 19, we see that at first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called out to Daniel. He doesn't remove the stone because, of course, he didn't want to see his friend that way, because he knew the obvious outcome of throwing someone down there. And he calls out to Daniel in the lion's den. In verse 20, he says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, again, who you serve continually, what a legacy. Has he been able to rescue you from the lions? Now, if you've been around church for any period of time, you know how this story ends. We're not going to go there yet, because it's actually not what today's about. It's actually not the powerful part of this story. It's actually not the reason why this story is legendary. The legendary thing, the amazing thing, the whole point of this message today has already happened. Daniel decided to lead with integrity, even though it was going to cost him. That's what made him a legend. You see, Daniel's primary concern was not the outcome of his decision. Daniel's primary concern was faithfulness to God. Well before he knew that God would come through, and I'm sure Daniel believed that God would, but he said, even if he doesn't, that's not the win. My life being saved isn't the win. Would I love that to happen? You know, Daniel, I'm sure, was like, hey, God, it'd be really great if you came through here. But that wasn't the win for Daniel. The win for Daniel was integrity. It was submission. It was commitment. It was being faithful to God. Which leads me to ask myself this question, and I hope leads you to ask you a similar question as well. What's my win? Like, what's my ultimate? When my integrity is challenged, or when my plans come in, conflict with one another, or my ultimate goal and hope and dreams and desires for my life, when they're confronted with a reality and I'm given the opportunity to have a choice, like, what's my win? What's your win? I think this is such an important thing for you and I to wrestle with. Like, what's the thing? What's your ultimate? Like, as you walk upright and you keep your eyes focused on something ahead of you, like we talked about in Proverbs at the beginning of our service, like what are your eyes on? And is it something strong enough and firm enough and powerful enough that you would be willing to anchor your integrity to it, to anchor your faithfulness to it? Or are you willing to compromise? And here's just what I've learned, and this is one of the hardest parts for me about and I love being a pastor. I love being your pastor. One of the hardest parts for me in this job is I sit across from men and women over and over and over and over again who've either been hurt by someone who chose a different path than integrity, or they themselves have screwed up and blown up their own life because of a lack of integrity. And the thing that I have learned over and over and over again from them and from my own versions of chaos is that everything that you and I gain by sacrificing our integrity can and will be taken away in the end. That when we look at the things that Jesus has called us to do, and he's, has given us very clear instructions for what it looks like to submit to his will and his ways, that when we wiggle off of that a little bit, we choose a different path, and we maybe even gain something that we hoped for, that we wanted, that in the end it'll end up being a loss. And Daniel knew that was true. That even if he chose not to pray and that he avoided being thrown in the lion's den, that in the end he would lose, because his win, the ultimate win, was faithfulness to God. Last week, I shared this quote with you. It's one of my favorite quotes from a pastor who faithfully pastored a church in Atlanta for a very long time. His name was Dr. Charles Stanley. He had this to say about this type of radical obedience, radical submission, high integrity. He had this to say: obey God and leave the consequences up to him. Or if you're not a follower of Jesus, live with integrity and leave the consequences up to I don't know, just life, right? But if you're a follower of Jesus, leave the consequences up to him because he's the one that sits ultimately. He's God's last and final king, that any kings that come before him or after him, that all of them, they will fail and fall away. But for you and I, as we walk in integrity and keep our eyes fixed on him, when we obey him, we just go, you know what, God, I'm going to be faithful with what is directly in front of me, and I'm going to trust you with the rest. It's one of my favorite quotes. And there's these moments that I can think of them throughout my life where I'm like, I know what I want to do and I know what makes sense to do, but it's not the right thing. It's not the way of integrity. It's not the way of the king. So I'm just going to do my best to obey God and leave the consequences up to him. A few years ago, I learned that this quote, this very famous quote from Dr. Charles Stanley, actually came out of a moment in a season in his life long time ago. He was the pastor of a very large church at the time, and there was a bunch of stuff that was going on, and it's a very long story. It's not even my story to tell. But he was faced with this big decision that he needed to make, and the decision that he had to make was going to cost him something. It was most likely going to cost him his job, or at the bare minimum, it was going to cost him half of his church leaving. It was a giant mess, and he was so stressed out about it and was praying through it. And the story goes that he was sitting in his office the day that he needed to make this final decision. And a wise sage, this elderly, amazing woman in their church, showed up and knocked on the door, and she probably was one of the only people in the whole church that knew him as Charles. She knocked on the door and she said, "Charles, can I come in?" He brings her in, and she's got this thing in her hands that he says was so much bigger than she was and had a blanket over it. And she said, "I brought you a gift today." She said, "I know you've got a big decision that you need to make, and I thought that this would help." And she handed Charles this beautiful painting. It's this painting you see here. This painting was done in around 1825 by a famous Italian painter. And he said, "Oh, thank you so much. I love the story of Daniel in the lion's den." And she goes, "Psst, psst, psst. Charles, what do you notice about the painting?" And Charles writes, and kind of as he's telling the story, he says that he looked at her and he goes, "I noticed Daniel's focus. His eyes are not on the lions. His eyes are not on the consequences. His eyes are not on the eventual fallout and chaos and pain and disaster. His eyes are on his king." And it was a few days after that on a little sticky note, he just wrote, "Obey God and leave the consequences up to him." What a powerful, powerful moment and a powerful story of a man named Daniel. We pick up back in our story in Daniel 6:20. The king calls out to Daniel down in the lions and said, "You didn't think I was going to leave you hanging on how the story ends, did you? Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And I hope that Daniel just stayed quiet for a little while just to screw with the king, And he responds and he says, "My God sent his angel and he shut the mouths of the lion, and they have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." Daniel did not know what would happen in that lion's den. He just didn't know. There was no way of knowing. But again, that wasn't the win for him. The outcome wasn't the thing he was focused on. He was focused on something bigger and better. And here's something hard that I think you and I have got to wrestle to the ground and own today, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. And it's this, that if the outcome matters more to us than doing the will of our King, if the ultimate outcome matters more to us than faithfulness to our King, then you and I, we're not followers. Like when we think about the things that Jesus has invited us into and the ways that he's invited us to live and walk, that if the outcome of our decision matters more to us than faithfulness to him, we're not followers, we're users. Like if following Jesus is just a means to an end for you, if integrity is just a means to an end for you that comes to an end when God's way no longer serves what you want, then you're just a user, and I'm just a user. And Judas tried this, by the way, and it didn't turn out very well for him, and I promise you it will not turn out very well for us. You see, Daniel's legacy lives on because of his faithfulness and his commitment to following. And the man, by the way, who conspired against Daniel, well, things didn't go very well for him. I'm not even going to teach through the rest of the passage because it gets really dark and there's kids in here, but I'll give you a little teaser. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den. And again, this was King Darius's choice, okay? This is just history. So were their wives, and so were their children, and so were their children's children. Their entire legacy wiped off the map by King Darius. And Daniel's a legend. Because integrity is the thing, it's the choices the legends are made of. Integrity is making the right choice regardless. It's obeying God and leaving the consequences up to him. That is a legacy. And whether you realize it or not, whether you're a college student, you're a grandparent, you're a husband, you're a wife, you're a mom, or a dad, you're leaving behind a legacy. And your kids are watching, and your neighbors are watching. If you're a follower of Jesus, your coworkers are watching, and they're wondering, when the heat and the pressure is on in the moment, who and how do you choose? Is your faith, is my faith just a means to an end that comes to an end when the lion's den is ahead of us? We're breaking up with someone we're not supposed to be with, this isn't the right fit, or, like, do we go, hall pass, Or when it comes to how you manage your finances, or when it comes to how you view and treat your neighbors, or whatever your thing is, because we all have a thing that feels tense to us, and it makes us want to go, God, you can have my whole life except for this one thing, We'll sing about it, you can have it all. And we're like, except for this one, Is that the legacy that we want to leave? I can promise you this, it won't be the thing that legends are made of. About 5 years ago, I sat across from a dad, and things in his world were blowing up because of his own choices, and his wife was leaving, and things were complicated with his kids, and it was rough. And we're sitting at breakfast, and I said something to him that I've now recited, I feel like, over and over and over again in similar conversations like this. And I said, hey, I want you to realize that the choices that you make now, that they matter way more than you think that they do. Because whether you realize it or not, how you choose and the way that you live with integrity, and he was a follower of Jesus, that your faithfulness to your King, that the way that you move and the way that you walk leaving forward is all part of history. You're making history. And it's not a story, it's not history that you're going to tell, it's the story that your children will tell. And it's the story that's going to play in the background of your mind when your daughter one day is getting married and is going to ask herself, do I want Dad to walk me down the aisle? Did he treat my mom the way that I hope my husband treats me someday? We sat across from breakfast, and he had tears in his eyes, and he's like, you're right, I'm making history, and it's time for me to write a better story. So Anthem, I don't know what your thing is. I don't know what your path looks like. I don't know what your tension of integrity moment is going to be or what it has been, but my thing I just beg you to do is to choose a story worth telling, to walk with integrity, to walk upright, to keep your eyes focused on what the long-term story, the long-term history that you're a part of, that you're creating, that one day it'll be a story worth telling, that your kids will be proud to tell. Maybe it'll be the stuff of legends. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we come before you. I come before you, just so grateful that that I don't have to do all of this alone, that like integrity doesn't fully depend on me, that because of my relationship with you, that you give me the courage and the strength when I need to do what's right. And God, that is true for every man and woman in this room that has decided to follow you. You've promised that just like you were with Daniel in the lion's den, that you are with us. And God, we don't know what the outcomes of our life are going to be. We may very well not survive the lion's den, but that's not our win, or at least we don't want it to be our win, God. Would you help us to make you, faithfulness to you, our win? And the only way we can do that is with your strength and with your courage and your peace and your joy and all the things that we get from you. Would you give us the strength to make the choices that legends are made of? Jesus, we're grateful for your love for us and this amazing story about Daniel that we heard today. Would you allow it to transform and change our lives, not just today, but tomorrow and every day afterwards as we make history together with you? It's in your name we pray. Amen.